Hi everyone, my name is Laura Gryder and today I'm going to be talking about pertussis. So pertussis is also known more commonly as whooping cough. It's caused by a bacterium called Bordetella pertussis, and you can see a slide of that right here in this image. The disease progresses through 3 stages. The first stage is the catarrhal stage. And that can last anywhere from 1 to 2 weeks. The symptoms include runny nose, low-grade fever, mild occasional cough, and you become, towards the end of this stage, highly contagious. What's kind of dangerous about this disease is that the beginning stages of it look like the common cold, so it kind of slips through the cracks. The second stage is the paroxysmal stage, and this lasts from 1 to 6 weeks. It can go into 10 weeks, and the symptoms just get worse. You have rapid coughing followed by a whooping sound. This is because you're coughing over and over again, and you aren't giving any opportunity to breathe in. So after you have your fit of coughs, after that point, you have an intake in breath, a large so that's where the disease actually got its name, from the whooping sound that they make, trying to recover from the coughing fits. During this time, you could also, you may vomit, turn blue, stuff like, from lack of oxygen, stuff like that. Stage 3 is the convalescent stage. This lasts about 2 to 3 weeks, and so you're no longer contagious at this time, but you are susceptible to other respiratory infections. So say if you get a cold or something like that, it's just going to happen more easily because you're recovering. Symptoms and complications. So as I said earlier, you have this spasmodic coughing, followed by the characteristic whoop in recovery, trying to get your breath. Apnea can occur when you're laying down because you have all of this mucus in your respiratory system. Cyanosis, that just means lack of oxygen makes you appear blue on your lips or your face. And it's because you just aren't getting enough oxygen. You aren't able to breathe because you're coughing so much. Post-tussive vomiting, that can occur from really violent fits of coughing. You may vomit. And again, at the beginning of pertussis, you have cold-like symptoms. And in some cases, particularly infants, you can have acute encephalopathy, which is brain swelling. So this is a potentially very dangerous disease, particularly so for very young infants. So fatality rates for pertussis in 2014 in the United States, according to CDC data, you have the highest amount of deaths in infants aged 3 months or less. 8 infants died during that period of time. You had 1 infant between 3 and 11 months, 2 children between 1 and 4 years of age, and you actually had 2 adults over 55 years of age that died during this year, for a total of 13 deaths in 2014, which is still high considering this is a vaccine-preventable disease. Globally, in 2008, there were 89,000 deaths from pertussis, and in 2014, you had a total of around 140,000 cases of pertussis. And globally, we have at this period of time, so in 2014, about 80. So who is the highest risk for contracting pertussis? Well, obviously, as I've spoken before, infants, less than 6 months old with less than 3 DTaP shots, they are at the highest risk. Adolescents and adults are also at risk, those who do not have their Tdap boosters, but they really aren't going to have the severe adverse health outcomes that often happen with infants. And you have the same high risk groups globally as with the U.S. It's just there's probably going to be even more cases outside of the U.S. with lack of access to vaccinations and timely vaccinations, so to keep on your schedule. A study from 2000 looked at children with vaccine exemptions and without vaccine exemptions, and they found that pertussis was higher in children with vaccination exemptions versus no exemptions. It makes sense. The relative risk was actually 5.9 for those children with the vaccination exemptions. We actually found, or that study actually found that pertussis in vaccinated children who were in counties with higher rates of exemptions versus counties with lower rates of exemptions were also had a higher relative risk. So they were 90% more likely to get, these vaccinated children were 90% more likely to have pertussis than other vaccinated children in a county with, lower rates of vaccination exemptions. So these vaccination exemptions affect everyone. They found that schools with outbreaks of pertussis, when compared with schools without outbreaks of pertussis, they had a higher prevalence of vaccine-exempted students. So there were 4.3% of vaccine exemptions in the schools with outbreaks, and the schools without outbreaks had 1.5% exemptions, and that difference was statistically significant. So historically, when you think back on what pertussis was like before the vaccine, so the vaccine was created in the 1940s. So this was actually a very common childhood disease. I remember, watching movies about this era, and they would talk about whooping cough. It was a very common thing, and the data actually shows that 5 out of every 1,000 children born would die of pertussis in the early 20th century. That's unbelievable. In 2014, the incidence in the So what's the burden of pertussis? Well, in the U.S., according to 2014 CDC data, you see that age is the most significant demographic variable affecting pertussis incidence. So the crude incidence shows that the highest rates are among the age group 11 to 19 years old. You have about 33.8% of all pertussis cases fall within that age range, and the lowest is among 6 to 11 month olds, 2.7%. But when you adjust for age, the incidence rates show the groups that are actually truly really affected by this disease. The highest incidence is among infants less than 6 months of age, so 169 cases per 100,000. And the lowest incident is among those who are 20 years and older, about 2.2 cases per 100. So I already spoke a little bit about the demographic distribution of age and how infants and neonates are disproportionately affected by this disease. But what I didn't talk about was that there actually is a race ethnicity component to the distribution of this disease. There's a higher incidence among whites than blacks, so you have about 3 per 100,000 cases in whites to 1.4 per 100,000 cases in blacks, and that's across all age groups. And what's also interesting is that there's a higher rate of pertussis among Hispanic infants. So of Hispanic infants, of all pertussis cases, about 29% are Hispanic infants. But Hispanic infants actually only represent about 18% of the population. So there's something disproportionate going on there. Seasonality, pertussis isn't particularly seasonal. You don't really see a spike in winter months like you do with the cold, but you do see. So here are some cool maps that I found. The one on the right is from 2008 data from the CDC, so it's a little bit old, but it just shows the average annual reported whooping cough cases per 100,000 population. So you see Nevada's kind of low, around 2 to 4 per year per 100,000. And as with, it kind of maps on to that other map that I showed earlier of exemptions. You see Colorado's really high, Washington, Oregon, they're really high. It maps on pretty well, actually. On the left is 2014 data, so definitely more recent data of incidents of reported pertussis by state. So I highlighted Nevada, which is of interest to us. We have 5.2 per 100,000 cases of pertussis in 2014, which equals about 144 cases. On the low end, you have West Virginia, which only has 1 case per 100,000, so 18 cases in that state. And Montana at the other end with 48.7 per 100,000 cases of pertussis, and they had 494 cases there. Pretty crazy. So the CDC has been collecting data on pertussis since 1922. And this graph represents that. So you see 1922, and on the axis you see number of cases, starting with 50,000 and going up to 300,000. And the rates are pretty high in 1922. And then you see around 1940, the DTaP was initiated and available to the United States public. And you can really see how the rates just drop significantly after that, and were pretty much flatlined for a number of years. And then towards the end of this period in time, you have these bumps in pertussis rates in the 2000s. And I hope Matthew McConaughey vaccinates too.